Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first part of our new module, which is Module 8, Clinical Psychology. So we're going to start off very briefly just kind of going over clinical psychology in general, then we're actually going to jump right into our first section as well right after that. So again, introducing psychological disorders just in general to start off. So the first thing we want to do is just understand what do we mean when we say psychological disorder? What does that actually refer to? So the technical definition is psychological disorder is a syndrome which marked by a clinically significant disturbance in an individual's cognition, emotion regulation, or behavior. So a syndrome is a collection of symptoms, right? So symptoms are, behaviors or changes in, what's going on with your body or what you're physically doing or how you're thinking, right? So we want to look for a collection of symptoms that are both clinically significant, which is really, really important. And again, obviously, they need to be psychological. So cognition, emotion regulation, behavior are all psychological things. We're not necessarily going to be obviously looking at, biological changes as far as, like a cold is going to cause changes, but it's going to be biological as opposed to psychological. Now, how do we decide what it means to have a clinically significant disturbance? What does that mean? Generally speaking, kind of the simplest way to think about it is that these are things that are going to interfere with day-to-day life. Now, this doesn't mean that to have a psychological disorder it has to have a negative impact on you every single day. It's just more of the things that you're experiencing need to be, I don't know if I want to use the word extreme enough, but have to be enough where it is causing an impact on regular day-to-day life things. It causes challenges, getting up and getting ready, going to work, going to school, doing the basic things that you need to do in your life. That's what we're looking for when we talk about having a significant disturbance. This is not going to be things that are, for example, I think a good example of this maybe is like depression, right? If you get sad one time or every once in a while when something bad happens, that doesn't mean you have depression, right? We would be looking for something that is going to interfere on a regular basis, on a day-to-day basis, and be kind of more extreme, right? A little bit stronger than just kind of regular sadness necessarily. Now, that being said, how we actually specifically define significant disturbance does change over time. So what that means changes as, we go through history, as life changes, as psychology changes, as we learn new things, right? This definition gets tweaked and changed a little bit as well. So it's obviously not always going to remain constant necessarily. So let's talk a little bit about the kind of models that we have of psychology or of psychological disorders. The first one is what is called the medical model. So the medical model is the concept that diseases, right, have physical causes that can be diagnosed, treated, and in most cases cured. Now, obviously for us, we're referring to psychological disorders, but the medical model is going to view psychological disorders the same way we view other illnesses, right? So if you get the flu, right, that flu can be diagnosed. We have symptoms that we look for. There are specific treatments that we give. Usually they're going to be, when we're talking about medicine or medical model, there's usually going to be some sort of like medications or surgeries or some sort of treatment that we have. And then in most cases, we're looking to cure it. Okay. Obviously not always. We're not always going to be able to do that, but that's kind of what we're looking for at the end. So the medical model is going to view psychological disorders pretty much the same way we view other diseases. We're going to look at them through the same kind of lens. Now, the other piece that's very important with this is that it looks at these and assumes that there is a physical cause. So the medical model would look at psychological disorders and say, if we look at maybe the brain chemistry, the chemistry in your brain, we might be able to then use that to diagnose you with a certain disorder, right? And that there is a biological cause or a biological root that all of these disorders, stem from. The biopsychosocial approach argues that disorders reflect genetic predispositions and physiological states, inner psychological dynamics, and social and cultural circumstances. So again, this is kind of looking a little bit broader. So as you can kind of imagine, right, biopsychosocial is kind of looking at all of these different pieces. So we're going to be looking at the biological aspects, like your genetic predispositions, like your physiology. It's going to be looking at the inner dynamics of your psychology, how you think, how your cognition works. It's going to be looking at what's happening to you, socially, what's happening to you in your environment, and all of these pieces, they say, come together, and then those are going to be reflected in these different disorders, or how we act to them, or whether or not we're likely to, have them. It's going to, answer kind of all these different questions. Now, when we are looking at psychological disorders, one of the really important things is understanding how do we, pull these different disorders apart? How do we diagnose them? How do we, look at them? And one of the biggest things that we use is what is called the DSM. Now, we are on the 5th edition at this point, so this is the DSM-5. And they come out with a new one just basically whenever they decide that there are major changes that need to be made. So if I remember correctly, the DSM-5 actually came out about 2012 or 13, I want to say. Actually, I think it was 2014. Right around there, I was in college at the time, and I was in a psychology class, so I remember them talking about the transition from the DSM-4 to the DSM-5, right? Each new edition is obviously going to look a little bit different. It might classify things different. It might add more information. It might add treatments. It might add, different symptoms that we're looking for. That's just going to be different views. You can kind of think of this as like the encyclopedia of psychological disorders is kind of a good way of thinking about it. These DSM is also going to be very reflective of similar things that we see in other medical sciences. So if you were just a regular doctor, right, you also would have similar type books that would have different, different types of illnesses, different types of, if you were a surgeon, maybe different types of surgical things that are just going to kind of give you the basics and general and important information about all sorts of things related to your field, right? This is going to be the most widely used system for classifying these different disorders. If you work in the United States, you use the DSM-5, right? If you go to a different country, you may use something a little bit different, but if you're in the US, you're going to be using the DSM-5. So the next question is, how do we classify these disorders? Now, we're going to kind of start looking at that, and that's really what most of this, or a lot of this unit is about, is just kind of breaking them apart a little bit. But it is important to understand that classifications are not perfect. They don't always do exactly what we want, or they're not necessarily perfectly pinpointed to exactly what we want to look at. So there are criticisms of it. So one of them, for example, is that some disorders, so ADHD is a very good example of this, can be very broad. The criteria, the symptoms that we're looking for are really, really broad. And because of that, it tends to kind of be able to encompass things that would actually be considered regular behavior. So for example, with like ADHD, we might be looking for something like hyperactivity or struggling to focus. Well, the reality is if you go to, any 8-year-old kid, you could probably argue that they're hyperactive and that they struggle to focus sometimes, right? So it can be tricky sometimes when some of our disorders have very, very broad kind of criteria that we're fitting. So sometimes that can be a negative. In addition, these labels can often be subjective. So like I said, this is always kind of shifting and changing. But, for example, what does it mean to be hyperactive? What is the technical definition of that? And again, it's psychology, so it does need to fit a relatively broad scope. But at the same time, right, we don't want it to be too subjective. So sometimes there's kind of this balancing act of going on of, where is the line between this disorder and that disorder? Where is the line between normal behavior and disorder? And then lastly, we do know that labeling these disorders can actually cause problems. So, for example, if we label someone as, having ADHD, of being bipolar, of having a certain type of depression, for example, it can cause changes in how others interact with them, and it can also cause changes in their own behavior. right? So because of this, sometimes some people argue that, labeling these different disorders, period, is maybe a negative, right? So these are kind of some of the critiques that there are of the way that we look at psychological disorders. So this is just kind of this first piece. We're going to move right on into the next one. So our first section, the first pieces that we're going to be looking at is anxiety disorders, obsessive-compulsive disorders, and post-traumatic stress disorder. So again, these are not necessarily all under the same umbrella. We're going to kind of be looking at a few umbrellas. So our first example here is anxiety disorders. This is kind of our first group. Now, in anxiety disorders, there are other disorders. And I do want to mention, too, as we jump into these first ones, there's a few really, really important things. One is please do not self-diagnose yourself. Do not try and diagnose other people. We are going very, very loosely over the surface. We're not delving super deep into any of these. And then in addition, obviously, we're not going to be exhausting these out, right? So there's going to be plenty of disorders that we skip, we don't talk about at all. There's going to be ones that we may not really say much about other than just kind of mentioning their name. So again, our first example is anxiety disorders. Anxiety disorders are psychological disorders characterized by distressing, persistent anxiety or maladaptive behaviors to reduce anxiety. Okay, so again, obviously an anxiety disorder, anxiety is the key criteria that we're looking for. There are 4 big ones that we're going to look at: generalized anxiety disorder, social anxiety disorder, panic disorder, and phobias. Now, social anxiety disorder, we're not really going to look at specifically, but what it is in general is the intense fear and avoidance of social situations. Again, probably pretty straightforward for what you're thinking about. So let's talk first about one of our big ones, which is generalized anxiety disorder, or GAD. Generalized anxiety disorder is an anxiety disorder in which a person is continually tense, apprehensive, and in a state of autonomic nervous system arousal. Now, what separates this from other anxiety disorders is that general anxiety disorder is general, as you can imagine. It is not linked to any specific thing. It's not linked to a specific stressor. So, for example, when we look at phobias in a little bit, right, you may have a phobia of, for example, snakes. Now, if you don't run into any snakes or images of snakes, or no one talks about them, or you don't see them or whatever, you basically go along your life as normal, right? Nothing happens. If you have generalized anxiety disorder, you are pretty much constantly feeling anxiety, right? You're constantly aroused autonomically. You are constantly feeling tense. You're constantly apprehensive. It is just all the time, okay? One thing we do see that's interesting about general anxiety disorder is that it becomes rarer later on in life. So it's more common at younger ages, and then as people get older, it just kind of seems to either go away or we don't see it as much. Again, this isn't necessarily saying that it does just go away with age, but there is obviously some sort of correlation between age and generalized anxiety disorder. Our next anxiety disorder is panic disorder. So panic disorder is an anxiety disorder marked by unpredictable, minutes-long episodes of intense dread in which a person may experience terror and accompanying chest pain, choking, or other frightening sensations, often followed by worry over a possible next attack. So what we're really is going to characterize these panic disorders is panic attacks, right? We didn't necessarily name it that way, but if you know anything about panic attacks, that description probably made pretty good sense. Now, the thing about panic disorder that's very important to understand is that there's obviously the panic attack part, which is I think what most people think about. You focus in on these very, very, very intense episodes of fear. And those are, I think, what we focus on because it's easy to see, right? When someone has a panic attack, it can be very apparent because they literally can't breathe. They literally are hyperventilating. You can kind of see it. Now, with panic disorder, though, it's not just the fact that we have these panic attacks, but what often is going to come with that is general anxiety about having another attack, right? So once we start having panic attacks or even one panic attack, it becomes, there's a possibility where basically now I'm going to be worried about it. Now I'm going to be anxious, in general, because I'm thinking about, am I going to have another panic attack? Is it going to happen, while I'm in class? Is it going to happen while I'm with somebody I like, while I'm driving a car, right? So all of a sudden we have not only these really, really intense panic attacks, but then we also have anxiety about then having panic attacks as well. So we can kind of see how there's two pieces that come with panic disorder a lot of times. Not always, but a lot of times. The last one is phobias. So phobias, you probably already know at least a little bit about. What phobias are an anxiety disorder that is marked by persistent, irrational fear and avoidance of a specific object, activity, or situation. Now, one thing that's important about phobias is that these are irrational fears with avoidance of those things. So, for example, if you are, let's say you're out. I don't know why I was gonna say let's say you're in Africa on a safari. I don't know why that was the example that came in mind, but that's what we're gonna do. So you're out in Africa on a safari, and there's a lion comes up to the Jeep or whatever you're in, right? If you were to feel fear in that moment, that would be considered acceptable, right? Because it's it's rational, right? It's makes sense to be afraid of that thing because that could cause you actual harm. And on some level, a lot of phobias do have kind of at least some level of rational basis, right? So, for example, being afraid of snakes or being afraid of spiders or maybe sharks or things like that, or even heights, in a way that does make a little bit of sense, right? Because those things could harm you. What usually takes something from being just a regular fear and becoming now a phobia is how extreme this fear is to the point where it's irrational. So, for example, if I'm afraid of snakes, right, I might just not want to be around snakes. If I see one on the ground, I kind of avoid it. If I have a phobia of snakes, right, maybe I can't even see a picture of a snake, right, where that's getting to the point where it's irrational, right? There's no way that image could harm me. So that's where we're kind of stepping into the realm of, okay, this is now maybe going to be a phobia. And a good example we already saw when we looked at the, I think it's called My Extreme Phobias or My Animal Phobias. We saw the guy, he had all the tattoos, right, and he was afraid of pit bulls. And again, right, being afraid of pit bulls on its own maybe isn't necessarily something that's totally out of the question, right? But his fear was so extreme that he couldn't go to parks, right? Now that's where we're getting, okay, this is kind of irrational, right? Or he wasn't able to, remember he had to touch the little pit bull puppy, where there's no way this little puppy could do anything to harm him, but the fear is so strong, right? It's become kind of this irrational, more overly extreme fear of whatever this thing is. And again, there's all sorts of different phobias. We'll watch a little video that I'll just kind of look at some random ones, but there's tons and tons and tons of them. That's going to get us to obsessive-compulsive disorder. So obsessive-compulsive disorder, you often probably hear as OCD. So OCD has two parts. So this is the O and the C, right? So we've got unwanted repetitive thoughts, which are called obsessions, and unwanted repetitive actions, which are called compulsions. Now, to have OCD, you can have either or with these, right? So you can have obsessions but not compulsions. You can have compulsions but not obsessions, or you can have obsessions and compulsions. Okay. Now within OCD, there are other OCD disorders, right? We can kind of break them down into smaller ones. So, for example, we have hoarding disorder, which if you ever watched the show Hoarders, that's what they have, is a version of OCD. So hoarding disorder is where we're cluttering one's space with acquired possessions that you can't let go. So if you've ever watched the show Hoarders, you see people where they'll live in a house and their house will be completely full of, garbage sometimes, right? Where it's literally floor to ceiling of trash. and they can barely get in and barely move around in their house, but they're unable to get rid of those things. And there's kind of like a really intense kind of connection and fear of letting those things go, right? So again, we could see there's compulsions there. There's also obsessions there, right? This obsession that I have to keep these things or I have to bring these things back. That would be hoarding disorder. We also have what's called body dysmorphic disorder, which is a preoccupation with perceived body deficits. Now, again, we might have obsessions, we might have compulsions here. So I could be obsessed with the fact that, I don't know, my nose is too big, right? That could be an example of obsessive compulsive disorder, right? Where I'm just constantly thinking about it over and over and over again. Now, I may also take actions with this, I may not. We have trichotillomania. Trichotillomania is where people will pull their hair. So trichotillomania, when you can actually see examples of trichotillomania where basically people will sit there and they'll pull their hair out. And they'll just sit there and pull it and pull it and pull it, and they'll have like bald spots where they've literally sat and pulled all of their hair out, or they'll pull their eyelashes out. And that's, again, this compulsion. They have this kind of need to, for whatever reason, basically pull their hair. Basically, the same thing is excoriation disorder, which is kind of a similar idea, except for instead of hair pulling, they're picking their skin. So they'll basically just like pick. So I think a simple example, right? If you've ever had a scab, a lot of people will kind of pick at that scab. Someone with excoriation disorder will basically like pick and pick and pick and pick until it bleeds, it opens up. They'll keep picking it, and they'll basically just get scars all over the place because they can't stop. They'll basically never let it heal because they're just constantly picking at their skin. Again, all of these are just examples of OCD. And again, there are those two parts where we have obsessions and or compulsions, these repetitive thoughts or these repetitive actions. That gets us to post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. Again, another one that you've probably heard at least some about, throughout a lot of different things. So PTSD is a disorder characterized by haunting memories, nightmares, hypervigilance, social withdrawal, jumpy anxiety, numbness of feeling, and or insomnia that lingers for 4 weeks or more after traumatic experience. Now, you'll notice in this definition, it's getting a little more specific than some of our other ones. Again, if we were going to break these all down very, very specifically, we might be able to break them down into kind of more specifics. But you can also see where some of these kind of cutoffs are, right? So, for example, to have PTSD, it needs to linger for at least 4 weeks. If, for example, maybe you get in a car accident, and you're a little anxious about driving the next day, that wouldn't be considered PTSD. That would be considered kind of like normal anxiety. Now, if 3 months later you're still incredibly anxious about getting in a car, or you have nightmares about driving or getting in an accident, that maybe would now be considered PTSD, right? So you can kind of see where some of these cutoffs are. PTSD has a lot of variables. So there's all sorts of different things, and you can see at the image on the right, that can cause PTSD. We usually think about really intense experiences, right? So we usually think about going through something like a car accident or a disaster or war, but there's obviously kind of a much broader kind of scope of things that can fit, and really it's almost anything that can be considered traumatic, right? Anything that could harm you emotionally could possibly become PTSD. Now, there's a lot of kind of different variables as to whether or not someone will actually have PTSD, right? That's a pretty big question. So, for example, when we talk about soldiers going off to war, a huge number of them are probably going to have some sort of event that could be traumatizing, right? But it's not like every single one comes back and has PTSD, right? Obviously, there's a lot more than we'd probably like to that do, but it's not like every single one happens. So why is that? And basically what we say is that whether or not someone has PTSD is kind of a combination of the amount of stress that's experienced in the moment, the sensitivity of their limbic system, their genes, their gender may even be an aspect. There's kind of all of these different pieces that coalesce together that will kind of like determine whether or not someone ends up having post-traumatic stress disorder. All right. Oops. I think I skipped one. Yep. Here we go. So let's talk about these in general. Now, again, you can kind of notice that all of the ones we talked about today are at least kind of similar, right? They all seem to have at least a little bit of a connection to anxiety. Now, they're all not technically anxiety disorders, but they all have kind of a connection to this. So when we talk about these in general, right, what are some things that we can think about to better understand them? So we can look at conditioning, we can look at cognition, and we can look at biology when it comes to all of these different types of disorders. So, for example, conditioning can create links between fear and anxiety and situations, objects, or people, right? So, for example, we talked about in our learning unit how classical conditioning works, right? Where when we experience something, it can create links between emotions and, a situation, an object, a person. All of those can obviously be connected, especially with our anxiety disorders, especially with PTSD, right? Where we have these kind of triggers, right? We've been conditioned to feel something when we have this trigger happen to us. And then obviously if it happens over and over and over again, that could maybe be reinforcement. If we wanted to talk about cognition, we know that our thoughts and interpretations and experiences also contribute to anxiety. Right? We learn fear from others' experiences as well. So a simple way to think about this is if you're someone who tends to be anxious, you may be someone who thinks about being anxious. If you've ever done that before, what happens? It makes you more anxious, right? If you're nervous about, let's say, like talking in front of class or going to a new school and you start thinking about it, right? And you start playing those kind of situations over in your head, a lot of times what can happen is it actually makes me feel more anxious. It might make me interpret people in a way that is negative. It might make me even behave in a way that would cause me to feel even more anxious, right? You can kind of see how our thought process is also involved in these different kind of aspects. And then also too, obviously we learn from other people. So when something happens to somebody else, we also learn from that. So I can get anxiety from watching somebody else feel anxious. I can get anxiety from watching somebody else fail. I can get anxiety from, somebody else experiencing something really negative. All of those things can come together, and it's kind of, how cognition is in this mix as well. And then obviously biology is also an important factor to play up with. So, for example, our genetics are our genetic makeup, right, also influences our likelihood of developing a disorder. Now, we'll talk about this throughout this kind of unit. We can kind of look at this and look at certain disorders, and we can basically gauge, not perfectly, obviously, but we can kind of get percentages of how strong the link is between genetics and certain disorders. Right? So a simple example of this would maybe be something like schizophrenia. Schizophrenia tends to have a pretty strong genetic link where it's much more common to see schizophrenia in people who has ancestors or relatives that also have schizophrenia. Right? There seems to be a genetic link that's connecting it. Now, not everybody. That's not going to be every single person. But there tends to be a strong link there. Right? Where other disorders maybe won't have a very strong genetic link. So how your genetics are, what kind of makeup you have, can basically kind of make you, I think a good way to think about it is kind of like more susceptible or more likely to experience a disorder. We can say the same thing maybe with something like depression, right? Where if I have maybe genetics that make it more likely that I could experience depression, doesn't mean I will for sure, but if something happens, like an event, that maybe could trigger depression, maybe I'd be more likely to fall into that than somebody who has a little bit different genetic makeup. We know that these disorders also stem from an over-arousal of the brain. Now, this is specific to our anxiety disorders specifically, and PTSD and OCD. So anxiety is basically our brain kind of like being over aroused, right? Which is probably why it feels that way, right? That's why we think about autonomic arousal, is our brain is firing really, really quickly and our heartbeat starts racing, all those different things. So there is a biological kind of root that comes especially with these anxiety disorders, right? When we're talking about anxiety, we always have to have this kind of autonomic arousal. And what that means is that if you have a brain that is naturally easier to arouse or more likely to become aroused, that would probably predispose you to being more likely to maybe developing anxiety disorder. So you can kind of see how all of these different aspects can kind of come together, right? Where we're looking at the influences of our conditioning, our experiences in life, of our cognition, how we think, and our biology, what's actually going on within our bodies. So that'll wrap up this first section. Take a few moments and do a quick summary, and I'll see you guys next time.